They never saved me a seat at my own son's wedding. I stood at the entrance of the Grand Ashford Estate's ballroom, watching 200 guests settle into their assigned places while coordinators frantically checked their seating charts. My name appeared nowhere. Not at the family table where my ex-husband Richard sat with his new wife Crystal and her parents. Not at any of the carefully arranged tables draped in ivory linens and scattered with golden centerpieces. I had raised Marcus alone for 23 years, worked double shifts to put him through college, and somehow I had been erased from his wedding day like a pencil mark on draft paper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation had arrived 6 months earlier. Embossed letters on cream cardstock announcing the union of Marcus Allen Chen and Sophie Marie Whitmore. My son had called me that same evening, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Mom, I wanted to tell you in person, but Sophie's family insisted we send these out early. They have a lot of guests flying in from overseas. I should have known then. Should have heard the warning in his carefully chosen words. But I was too busy feeling grateful that he'd found someone, that he was building a life, that despite everything we'd been through he was happy. I had met Sophie exactly twice before the engagement. Both times were brief coffee meetings that felt more like interviews than casual conversations. She was polished in a way that made me acutely aware of my department store blazer and sensible shoes. Her mother, Patricia Whitmore, had been present at the second meeting, a tall woman with silver hair cut in a sharp bob that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She had asked me questions that sounded innocent but carried an edge. What do you do for work, Diane? Where did you grow up? Did Marcus's father stay involved in his upbringing? Each question was a small knife carefully placed. I'm in operations management, I had answered, which was technically true. I managed operations. The fact that I managed them for a multinational technology corporation that I had helped build from a struggling startup was information I had learned to keep close. Where I grew up in rural Ohio, in a town you've probably never heard of. Raised by a single mother who cleaned houses. Also true. Marcus's father left when Marcus was 2, and no, he wasn't involved. That truth still stung even after 2 decades. Patricia had nodded as if these answers confirmed something she already suspected. Well, it's wonderful that Marcus has done so well for himself despite the challenges. Her smile hadn't reached her eyes. Sophie is very fortunate to have found someone so ambitious. The subtext was clear. Marcus had done well in spite of me, not because of anything I had provided. Now, standing in the ballroom doorway, I felt that same dismissive assessment in physical form. A young woman in a black dress and headset approached me, her smile professionally apologetic. I'm so sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name on any of the seating assignments. Are you sure you're at the right wedding? The question was innocent enough, but it landed like a slap. Yes, I'm quite sure. I'm the groom's mother. Her eyes widened. Oh my goodness. There must be some mistake. Let me find the wedding planner. She hurried off, speaking urgently into her headset, leaving me standing there in my navy dress. I had chosen it carefully from Macy's clearance rack 3 months ago, had it altered to fit properly, paired it with shoes that didn't hurt after an hour of standing. It was appropriate, dignified, unremarkable. Exactly what I had aimed for. I had learned long ago that blending in was often the safest strategy, that drawing attention could lead to questions I wasn't ready to answer. Marcus appeared at my elbow within minutes, his face flushed beneath his perfectly styled dark hair. Mom, I'm so sorry. There was some kind of mix-up with the final head count. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. Sophie's mother was handling all the seating arrangements, and somehow your name got dropped from the list. A mix-up. As if my existence at my son's wedding was a clerical error that could simply happen. As if the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him could be accidentally forgotten. I kept my voice level, refusing to make a scene on his wedding day. It's fine, Marcus. These things happen. Where would you like me to sit? He looked around the rapidly filling ballroom with something like panic. I don't know. Everything's assigned. Maybe we can pull up a chair at one of the tables? Before I could respond, a voice cut through the ambient chatter. Excuse me, is there a problem here? I turned to see a man in his early 60s approaching us, his steel gray suit impeccably tailored, his silver hair swept back from a face that radiated calm authority. He looked vaguely familiar in the way that faces sometimes do when you've seen them in passing. Marcus straightened immediately, his expression shifting to something between respect and nervousness. Mr. Harrison, I'm sorry. Just a small seating issue with my mother. We're sorting it out. Thomas Harrison extended his hand to me, his handshake firm and his green eyes direct. Mrs. Chen, I presume? I'm Tom Harrison. I work with Sophie's father at Whitmore Industries. He turned to Marcus with a smile that didn't waver. I couldn't help but notice your mother doesn't seem to have a place at the family table. That seems like quite an oversight for the groom's mother. Marcus stammered something about last-minute changes and vendor communication issues, but Tom Harrison held up a gentle hand. No need to explain. These events can be chaotic. He turned back to me. Mrs. Chen, I would be honored if you would join me at my table. I have an extra seat, and I could use some intelligent conversation. My colleagues tend to talk shop all evening, and I'd welcome a fresh perspective. The offer was gracious, but I could see the calculation behind it. This man had recognized a social injustice, and was making a pointed statement by correcting it publicly. I appreciated the gesture even as I understood its implications. I would accept, of course. The alternative was to either stand awkwardly through the entire reception or leave my son's wedding, neither of which was acceptable. That's very kind of you, Mr. Harrison. I would appreciate that. Marcus looked torn between relief and embarrassment. Mom, you don't have to. I can figure something out. I'm sure we can squeeze a chair somewhere. It's already handled, Tom Harrison said smoothly. Table 12. I look forward to our conversation, Mrs. Chen. He nodded to both of us and walked away, leaving Marcus to fumble through an apology I no longer had the energy to accept graciously. I made my way to table 12, located near the dance floor but not quite at the center of the action. 5 people were already seated, all looking prosperous and comfortable in the way that comes from never having worried about money. Tom Harrison stood as I approached, pulling out a chair between himself and a blonde woman in her 50s wearing an emerald dress that probably cost more than my car payment. Everyone, this is Diane Chen, the groom's mother, Tom announced. She'll be joining us this evening. The table greeted me with varying degrees of curiosity and welcome. The blonde woman, who introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, chief marketing officer at some company I didn't catch, gave me a warm smile. How wonderful. We were just saying this table needed some balance. Too much corporate talk already. The others introduced themselves, a blur of names and titles. David something, venture capitalist. Jennifer and Robert, both attorneys. An older gentleman named Frank who said he was retired but had the bearing of someone who had once wielded considerable power. Tom Harrison poured me a glass of wine from the bottle on the table without asking, a small gesture that suggested he was accustomed to taking care of people. So, Mrs. Chen, tell me about yourself. What do you do when you're not attending weddings? The question was casual, but I had learned to navigate these waters carefully. I work in operations, I said, which was my standard answer. Technology sector. Been with the same company for about 18 years now. Very stable, very rewarding work. Catherine leaned forward with interest. Which company, if you don't mind my asking? I do consulting work with several tech firms. I might know them. Probably not, I deflected smoothly. We're fairly specialized. Enterprise solutions, mostly back-end systems. Nothing consumer-facing. It was a careful dance, providing information without actually revealing anything. The truth was that I was Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Nexus Technologies, a position I had fought for and earned through nearly 2 decades of 70-hour weeks and relentless competence. I held stock options that were worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. My annual salary was substantial enough that I could have retired years ago if I wanted. But I had learned early in my career that being a woman, being a single mother, being someone who didn't come from money, meant that every achievement was questioned. People assumed luck or connections or that I had somehow taken shortcuts. They rarely assumed competence. So I had become careful about what I shared, especially in social situations where my role as Marcus's mother was more relevant than my role as a corporate executive. The ceremony began before our conversation could go deeper. Marcus stood at the altar looking nervous and young, despite being 23 and about to start his own life. Sophie appeared at the top of the aisle in a dress that must have cost $50,000, all lace and crystals and flowing silk. She was beautiful and I could see why Marcus loved her. She had a delicate grace, a certainty in her movements that came from a lifetime of never having to doubt her place in the world. Patricia Whitmore walked beside Sophie's father, Richard, her expression serene and satisfied. She had orchestrated this day perfectly, every detail aligned with her vision of what her daughter's wedding should be. That I had no seat in that vision was not an oversight. It was intentional. I had known it the moment Marcus had stammered his explanation. Patricia Whitmore had looked at me during those brief meetings and decided I didn't belong in her daughter's new family story. The ceremony was traditional, elegant, efficient. Marcus and Sophie exchanged vows written by someone else, promised forever in words that sounded borrowed. I watched my son become a husband and felt the strange mixture of pride and loss that comes from seeing someone you raise step fully into their own life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
When the officiant pronounced them married and they kissed, the room erupted in applause. I clapped along with everyone else, smiling because that was what you did, even when your heart was quietly breaking at being relegated to a stranger's table at your own child's wedding. The reception began with the usual rituals. First dance, father-daughter dance, mother-son dance. I waited for Marcus to come find me, to invite me onto the floor for that traditional moment. Instead, Patricia Whitmore swept forward and claimed him, her explanation carrying across the room through the microphone. Since Diane is sitting so far back, and Marcus considers me like a second mother, we thought it would be nice if I joined him for this dance. The applause that followed felt like a judgment. Tom Harrison leaned over to me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. That was exceptionally rude. I kept my expression neutral, my voice steady. It's her day. She can organize it however she likes. No, Tom said quietly. It's your son's day. And hers. But it's your son's wedding, and you should have been honored. The fact that I was being defended by a stranger at my son's wedding was almost worse than the original slight. Almost. Dinner was served in courses, each plate a work of art that probably tasted as expensive as it looked. Our table's conversation flowed around me. Talk of mergers and acquisitions, of market trends and investment opportunities, of vacation homes and charity galas. I listened and nodded and made appropriate comments when directly addressed, but mostly I observed. These were people who had never questioned their place in rooms like this, who had been raised understanding that they belonged at tables with linen and crystal and food that cost more per plate than many families spent on groceries in a week. Halfway through the main course, Tom Harrison turned to me with a directness that suggested he had been waiting for the right moment. So Diane, I have a confession. I don't actually work with Sophie's father at Whitmore Industries. I'm actually the CEO of Whitmore Industries. Her father works for me. The table went quiet. I looked at him, processing this information and what it meant. Patricia Whitmore had spent the entire engagement period emphasizing her family's connections, their importance, their place in society. And here was the man at the top of that particular hierarchy, sitting at table 12 with the dismissed mother of the groom. Tom continued, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. I also know who you are, Diane. Or should I say, Ms. Chen, Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Nexus Technologies? We've been in acquisition talks with your company for the past year. I've read every brief about your division. You've transformed their supply chain efficiency by 43% and cut operational costs by $30 million annually, while improving worker satisfaction metrics. That's not just impressive. That's extraordinary. The table was staring at me now. Catherine Morrison's mouth had actually fallen open slightly. I felt my careful mask slipping, the persona I had maintained all evening cracking under the weight of being seen. I don't advertise my position, I said carefully. It tends to complicate personal relationships. Tom nodded. I can understand that. But it does make me curious why you let Patricia Whitmore treat you like you're someone to be hidden away. Why you're sitting here instead of at the family table where you belong. Because my son asked me to, I said simply. Because making a scene at his wedding wouldn't change anything except make him uncomfortable. Because sometimes dignity means accepting poor treatment with grace, at least until you can address it privately. Tom studied me for a long moment. That's one approach. Or, you could let people know exactly who they're dismissing. Sometimes the best way to handle disrespect is to make it impossible to ignore. Before I could respond, Richard appeared at our table, my ex-husband looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. "Diane, could I speak with you for a moment?" I excused myself and followed him to a quiet corner near the gardens. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from our marriage. "Look, I know today hasn't been ideal for you. Crystal told me about the seating situation. I'm sorry. I should have caught that." "You should have," I agreed. "But you didn't. Just like you didn't catch a lot of things over the years." Richard had the grace to look ashamed. "I know I wasn't there for Marcus growing up. I know I left you to handle everything alone. But I'm here now, and I want to make sure he knows he has both parents supporting him." "Both parents," I repeated. Interesting that both parents weren't considered when the seating chart was made. "That wasn't my call," Richard said defensively. "Patricia handled all the details. She's very particular about these things." "She's very particular about class," I corrected. "About who she thinks belongs in her daughter's life and who doesn't. And apparently I don't make the cut, despite raising the man her daughter just married." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Patricia comes from old money. She has certain expectations. She doesn't mean anything by it." "Doesn't mean anything," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "Richard, I was removed from my son's wedding seating chart. That's not an oversight. That's a statement. And you standing here making excuses for her instead of defending me tells me everything I need to know about where your loyalties lie." I walked away before he could respond, before the anger I had been carefully controlling all evening could spill over into something I would regret. I returned to table 12 to find Tom Harrison in conversation with Marcus, who had apparently come looking for me. My son looked miserable, torn between his new wife's family and the mother he had essentially allowed to be erased from his own wedding. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the seating chart until this morning. By then everything was already set up, and Sophie's mom said it was too complicated to change." Tom Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Too complicated to add a chair for the groom's mother? That seems remarkably simple, actually." Marcus flushed. "I should have insisted. I should have made sure you had a proper seat." "I appreciate that, Marcus," I said gently, because he was still my son and this was still his wedding day. "But what's done is done. Mr. Harrison has been very kind in letting me join his table." Tom smiled. "It's been my pleasure. Your mother is fascinating company. We've been discussing supply chain optimization and its impact on market competitiveness. Much more interesting than the usual wedding small talk." Marcus looked between us, confusion crossing his face. "Supply chain optimization?" Tom's expression was innocent. "Yes. Your mother is quite knowledgeable about corporate operations. We've had a very enlightening conversation." I could see Marcus trying to reconcile this with whatever understanding he had of my work, which I realized was probably quite limited. He knew I worked in technology, knew I had a stable job, but I had been careful over the years not to emphasize my success. I hadn't wanted him to feel pressure, hadn't wanted money to define our relationship or his choices. Sophie appeared at Marcus's elbow, her perfect makeup starting to show slight cracks. "Marcus, we need to cut the cake soon. The photographer wants to get those shots before the evening light changes." She glanced at me with what might have been guilt or might have been dismissal. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Chen. Are you enjoying yourself?" "Yes," I replied evenly. "Table 12 has been wonderful. Your mother certainly knows how to organize an event." Sophie's smile tightened. "Mother is very good at details. She likes everything to be perfect." Tom Harrison stood smoothly. "Sophie, congratulations on your marriage. Your father has mentioned several times how happy you make him. It's clear you found something special with Marcus." Sophie's demeanor changed instantly at the mention of her father, her smile becoming genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. That means so much coming from you. Daddy speaks so highly of you. I hope you're enjoying the reception." "Very much," Tom assured her. "In fact, I was just telling your new mother-in-law how impressed I am with the Whitmore family's hospitality. Though I must say, I was surprised to find her seated so far from the family table. Surely that was an oversight?" Sophie's face colored. "There were a lot of people to accommodate. We had to make difficult choices." "Of course," Tom said smoothly. "Weddings are complex. So many details to manage." He paused, then added almost casually, though in my experience the most important people should always be prioritized, regardless of how complicated the logistics become. Otherwise, one risks sending the wrong message about what actually matters. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Sophie stammered something about understanding, then pulled Marcus away toward the cake cutting. I watched them go, my son looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry about that," I told Tom as we sat back down. "You didn't need to make them uncomfortable." He shook his head. "Diane, I'm a CEO. Making people uncomfortable when they behave poorly is part of my job description. And what happened to you today was unacceptable." The cake cutting proceeded without incident. More toasts, more dancing, more celebration of a union between two families where one side had been very clear about which family mattered more. I smiled through it all, applauded at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes. I had spent decades learning to navigate spaces where I wasn't entirely welcome, and this was just one more evening to get through with grace and tact. As the reception wound toward its end, Patricia Whitmore made her way to our table, her expression carefully pleasant but her eyes cold. "Mr. Harrison, I wanted to thank you personally for joining us this evening. I know Sophie's father values your presence tremendously." Tom stood, ever the gentleman. "Patricia, it's been a lovely event. You should be very proud." Patricia's gaze slid to me, then back to Tom. "I see you've been keeping Mrs. Chen company. That was very kind of you." The implication that I had needed charity, that I was someone to be pitied rather than respected, hung in the air. "Actually," Tom said, his tone remaining pleasant while his words carried weight, "Diane has been keeping me company. We've had a remarkable conversation about operational efficiency in the technology sector. Did you know she's one of the leading experts in global supply chain management?" Patricia's smile froze. "I was not aware." Tom continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. "Yes, we've been discussing the acquisition talks between my company and Nexus Technologies, where Diane holds a senior executive position. Her division's performance has been exceptional. In fact, her work is one of the primary reasons we're interested in the acquisition at all." I watched Patricia process this information, saw the moment when she realized that the woman she had relegated to an afterthought was actually someone with significant professional standing. The woman she had dismissed as just Marcus's mother from humble beginnings was an executive whose decisions could impact deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was not the vindication I had wanted, but it was impossible to ignore the shift in her expression. "Diane," Patricia said, her voice now dripping with a warmth that hadn't been there before, "I had no idea about your position. Marcus never mentioned you worked at such a high level." "Because I asked him not to," I said simply. "I preferred to keep my professional life and my role as his mother separate. I didn't want my career to define our relationship or his choices." Patricia's recovery was smooth, I'll give her that. "Well, how modest of you. If I had known, of course, we would have seated you more prominently. I'm sure you understand, with so many important guests to accommodate." "Of course," I replied, matching her false warmth with my own. Though I would have hoped that the groom's mother would be considered an important guest regardless of her professional credentials. The barb landed. Patricia's smile tightened. "Yes, well, as I said, there were many factors to consider." Tom Harrison interjected smoothly. "In any case, everything worked out well. Diane has been a delightful addition to our table. Though I do hope next time we see each other, it will be in a setting where everyone is properly acknowledged from the start." The message was clear. He was not letting this go, was not allowing Patricia to simply smooth over her deliberate slight with newfound respect based on professional status alone. Patricia excused herself quickly, retreating to the safety of her own family's table. Catherine Morrison leaned over once she was gone. "That woman is a piece of work. I'm sorry you had to deal with that today." "I'm used to it," I said honestly. "People make assumptions based on appearances. I've learned to navigate around it." "But you shouldn't have to," Catherine said firmly. "Not at your own son's wedding." Tom Harrison raised his glass. A toast, he declared. "To Diane Chen, who has shown more grace and dignity in the face of poor treatment than most people could manage. And to the reminder that true class has nothing to do with money or status, but everything to do with how we treat others when we think no one important is watching." The table raised their glasses. I felt unexpected tears prick my eyes, the kindness from strangers somehow more overwhelming than the dismissal from my son's new family had been. The evening ended with sparklers and goodbyes, with Marcus and Sophie departing in a cascade of well wishes and rose petals. Marcus hugged me briefly before he left. "I love you, Mom. I'm sorry today wasn't what it should have been." I hugged him back, this young man I had raised alone. "I love you too. Be happy, Marcus. That's all that matters." As guests departed and tables were cleared, Tom Harrison found me near the exit. "Diane, I hope this isn't too forward, but I'd like to invite you to lunch next week. Not a professional meeting, though I'm sure we'll end up talking business. Just a chance to continue our conversation in a more relaxed setting." I hesitated, unsure of his intentions. Tom seemed to read my thoughts. "Let me be clear. I have enormous professional respect for your work. But tonight, what I saw was someone being treated poorly, who handled it with remarkable composure. I'd simply like to get to know you better, away from weddings and corporate negotiations." I found myself agreeing, exchanging contact information, and leaving the Grand Ashford Estate with the strange sense that the evening, despite everything, had somehow shifted something fundamental. I had come to my son's wedding prepared to be invisible, to accept my relegation to the margins of his new life. Instead, I had been seen, recognized, and defended by someone who understood both the professional and personal dimensions of who I was. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. Most were from Marcus, increasingly frantic. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk. Sophie's parents are very upset. Mr. Harrison apparently called Sophie's father this morning. There's some issue with the Whitmore Industries acquisition. Please, Mom, call me back." I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Marcus and I had eaten countless meals together during his growing up years. The same table where I had helped him with homework, where we had celebrated his acceptances to college, where we had talked about his future and dreams. I thought about calling him back immediately, explaining, smoothing everything over. That's what I would have done before yesterday. That's what I had always done. But Tom Harrison's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the best way to handle disrespect is to make it impossible to ignore. I called Tom instead. He answered on the second ring, sounding amused. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I assume the Whitmores have been in contact? My son has left 17 messages," I confirmed. "He says you called Sophie's father about the acquisition?" "I did," Tom said cheerfully. "Had a very interesting conversation this morning. Told him that Nexus Technologies is now my top priority for acquisition, and that our success will depend heavily on retaining key leadership. Specifically, their Senior VP of Global Operations. I made it clear that any deal will include very generous retention packages for critical personnel. That's going to cost your company money, I pointed out. Worth every penny, Tom replied. Good executives are hard to find. Executives who can transform operations the way you have are even rarer. Besides, he added, his tone more serious, I meant what I said last night. What happened to you is unacceptable. And I believe in making sure people understand when they've miscalculated. I should call my son, I said. Explain the situation. That's up to you, Tom said. But Diane, consider this. You've spent decades making yourself smaller, hiding your accomplishments, trying not to make waves. Maybe it's time people saw you as you actually are. All of you, not just the parts you think they'll accept. I thanked him and ended the call, staring at my phone and the accumulating messages from Marcus. Finally, I called him back. Mom, thank God. What's going on? Mr. Harrison called Sophie's dad this morning, and suddenly everyone is talking about you and your job, and I don't understand what's happening. What don't you understand, Marcus? I asked quietly. That I work in technology? You've known that for years. Not that you're some high-level executive, he said, frustration clear in his voice. You let me think you were like a manager or something. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because, I said, choosing my words carefully, I didn't want your life to be defined by my success. I didn't want you to feel pressure to live up to something or to feel like you were in my shadow. I wanted you to find your own path, make your own choices, be your own person. And you did that, Marcus. You became a wonderful man despite everything, or maybe because of it. But along the way, I think you started to believe your mother was someone smaller than she actually is. There was silence on the other end. Finally, Marcus said, his voice thick, Mom, I'm so sorry about yesterday. Sophie's mom, she made all these assumptions and I didn't push back hard enough. I let her treat you like you didn't matter and that was wrong. I know, I said gently. And I forgive you because you're my son and I love you. But Marcus, we need to have a real conversation about what happened and why it happened. About the assumptions that were made and what that says about how your new family views me. We talked for over an hour. Marcus explained that Patricia Whitmore had indeed deliberately excluded me from the seating chart, that she had made comments about wanting Sophie's wedding to reflect a certain social circle, that she had expressed concerns about Marcus's background and my single mother status. Sophie had pushed back, Marcus insisted, but ultimately had deferred to her mother's planning. I'll fix this, Marcus promised. I'll talk to Sophie and her parents. We'll do a dinner, all of us together. They need to understand who you really are. That's the thing, Marcus, I said. They shouldn't need to understand my professional status to treat me with basic respect. I'm your mother. That should have been enough. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. Give me a chance to make this right, Mom. Please. I agreed because what else could I do? He was my son building his life, and I wouldn't sabotage that relationship over wounded pride, no matter how justified. The dinner happened 2 weeks later, not at the Whitmore family estate as Patricia had initially insisted, but at my penthouse in the city. The penthouse I had purchased 7 years ago as an investment but rarely used, preferring my smaller, more comfortable apartment in a modest neighborhood. I had Tom Harrison's words in my head as I prepared. Maybe it's time people saw you as you actually are. Patricia and Richard Whitmore arrived 15 minutes early, which I recognized as a power move. They were clearly expecting something different from what they found. My penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, original hardwood floors, and art I had collected over the years from artists whose work I genuinely loved rather than for investment value. It was elegant but lived in, expensive but comfortable. Patricia's eyes widened as I opened the door. Diane, what a lovely space. Is this a rental? I own it, I said simply. Please come in. Marcus and Sophie arrived moments later, Marcus looking nervous and Sophie looking curious. My son had clearly briefed her on at least some of what had transpired, though I suspected he had soft-pedaled my actual position and the implications of Tom Harrison's involvement in Whitmore Industries' business dealings. Dinner was catered by a chef I knew from my work on the board of a culinary institute, a woman who had earned 3 Michelin stars and who prepared food that was both exquisite and unpretentious. As we sat down to eat, Patricia couldn't seem to help herself. This is quite impressive, Diane. I had no idea you were doing so well for yourself. Has your situation improved recently? My situation has been consistent for about 15 years, I replied evenly. I've simply never had reason to discuss it before. Richard Whitmore, Sophie's father and technically Tom Harrison's subordinate, cleared his throat. Mr. Harrison mentioned you hold a significant position at Nexus Technologies. He seemed to imply your role would be critical in any potential acquisition. I'm Senior Vice President of Global Operations, I confirmed. I've been with the company since it was a startup. I hold considerable equity, and yes, my division's performance has been strong enough that it would factor into acquisition decisions. The conversation that followed was illuminating. Patricia and Richard asked questions, some out of genuine curiosity, others clearly fishing for information they could use to recalibrate their social calculations. I answered honestly but without elaboration, laying out the facts of my career and accomplishments without boasting but also without minimizing. Sophie asked the most thoughtful questions, about how I had managed single motherhood and a demanding career, about the choices I had made and the compromises I had navigated. You must have missed a lot of Marcus's childhood, Patricia interjected at one point, with clear implications that I had been an absent mother pursuing my career at my son's expense. I was at every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every sports event that Marcus participated in, I said calmly. I learned to be very efficient with my time. I also learned to ask for help when I needed it, and to build support systems that allowed me to be present for my son while also building my career. It wasn't perfect, but Marcus turned out wonderfully, so I must have done something right. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. You did everything right, Mom. I never felt like you weren't there for me. The evening concluded with Patricia and Richard offering what passed for an apology in their world, a carefully worded acknowledgement that they had made assumptions based on incomplete information, and that they hoped we could move forward with better understanding. I accepted their words at face value, knowing they were motivated more by social and professional considerations than by genuine remorse, but also knowing that this was likely the best I would get. After they left, Sophie pulled me aside. "Mrs. Chen, I need to apologize directly. I knew about the seating arrangement before the wedding. I knew my mother had excluded you, and I didn't push back hard enough. I told myself it was her day to plan as she wanted, but that was wrong. You're Marcus's mother. You should have been honored regardless of anything else." Her apology seemed genuine, and I appreciated it even as I understood that it was coming now, after revelations about my professional status, rather than simply because it was the right thing to do. "We'll move forward," I told her. "For Marcus's sake and for yours. But Sophie, understand this. I don't need to prove my worth through my career or my bank account. I'm valuable because I'm a human being, because I'm Marcus's mother, because I raised him with love and sacrifice. The fact that I'm also successful professionally is nice, but it shouldn't have been necessary for me to be treated with basic respect and dignity." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I understand, and I'm truly sorry. Moving forward, things will be different." I believed her, or at least I believed she believed it. Time would tell if the Whitmores could genuinely adjust their worldview or if they would simply fold me into their social calculations as someone who turned out to be more important than they initially assessed. Tom Harrison and I did have lunch and then dinner and then more dinners. Our connection evolved from mutual professional respect into genuine friendship and eventually into something more. He understood the compartments I had created in my life, understood why I had kept my professional success separate from my identity as Marcus's mother. He had built his own career through similar calculations, though from a position of more privilege than I had started with. 6 months after Marcus's wedding, Tom and I were sitting in my penthouse, watching the sunset paint the city gold, when he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you regret keeping your success private for so long? Do you wish you had let people see all of who you were earlier?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. I made the choices that felt right at the time with the information and resources I had. Would I do everything exactly the same if I could go back? Probably not. But I also gave Marcus a childhood where he wasn't defined by money or status, where he learned to value people for who they are rather than what they have. That matters to me. Tom nodded thoughtfully. "You know what I find most impressive about you? It's not your professional accomplishments, though those are remarkable. It's that you maintained your integrity through everything. You could have made that wedding about proving yourself, about showing the Whitmores exactly who they were dismissing. Instead, you showed grace and dignity even when you were being treated poorly. That takes real strength." The wedding seating incident became one of those stories that families tell, a moment that revealed character and tested relationships. Marcus and Sophie built their marriage with more awareness of class assumptions and privilege than they might have had otherwise. Patricia and Richard Whitmore learned, or at least appeared to learn, that status and worth come in forms they hadn't been trained to recognize. And I learned that it was possible to be seen fully, professionally successful and personally grounded, without having to choose between those identities. Years later, when Marcus's first child was born, I sat in the hospital room holding my granddaughter and watching my son with his wife and their new family. Patricia and Richard were there too, bearing expensive gifts and genuine excitement. Patricia caught my eye across the room and smiled, and in that smile was something like respect, or at least acknowledgement. We had traveled a long road from that wedding day when I stood in the ballroom doorway with no seat assigned. The journey had been uncomfortable and at times painful, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes being dismissed is the catalyst for finally being seen. The Monday morning after the penthouse dinner, I arrived at Nexus Technologies headquarters at 6:30, my usual time. The building was still mostly empty, just security personnel and a few other early arrivals like myself who preferred the quiet hours before the chaos began. My office occupied a corner on the 42nd floor, with views that stretched across the river and into the neighboring state. I had earned this space through years of relentless performance, through transforming a struggling operations division into the most profitable segment of the company. My assistant, James, a sharp young man fresh from business school who had turned down offers from more prestigious firms to work with me, was already at his desk when I arrived. He had coffee waiting, my schedule printed and annotated with his observations about potential conflicts or concerns. "Morning, Diane. You have the quarterly review at 9, the vendor negotiation at 11, and lunch with the board liaison at 1. Also, you received 17 emails over the weekend from Whitmore Industries, all marked urgent. I took the coffee and settled into my chair, the familiar ritual grounding me after the emotional turbulence of the past few weeks. Pull up the Whitmore emails. Let's see what they want. James brought up the messages on my larger monitor. They were from various executives at Whitmore Industries, all requesting meetings, all suddenly very interested in discussing operational synergies and integration strategies. The tone had shifted dramatically from the preliminary correspondence we had exchanged months ago. Before anyone there knew I existed beyond being Marcus's mother. Schedule meetings with their operations team for next week, I instructed James. Make it clear we're evaluating multiple acquisition offers, and that Nexus isn't committed to any particular buyer yet. I want them to understand that while we're open to conversations, we're not desperate for a deal. James nodded, making notes. That should recalibrate their expectations. Also, Tom Harrison's assistant called. He'd like to schedule a working dinner later this week if you're available. Tom and I had seen each other twice since the penthouse dinner, both casual meals where we talked about everything except business. He was careful not to mix our personal connection with the professional negotiations, understanding that my position required me to evaluate any acquisition offer on its merits, rather than personal relationships. But we both knew that eventually business would have to be addressed directly. Tell his assistant Thursday works if we can keep it to 2 hours. I have Marcus and Sophie coming for dinner at 8. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of executive work. The quarterly review revealed strong performance across all operational metrics, with my division once again exceeding projected targets by significant margins. The vendor negotiation was more challenging, requiring me to balance cost considerations against relationship management and long-term strategic value. By lunch, I was mentally exhausted in the way that came from hours of high-stakes decision-making where every choice had implications measured in millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. Rachel Torres, the board liaison and one of the few other women in senior leadership at Nexus, met me in the executive dining room. She was 10 years younger than me, brilliant and ambitious in ways that reminded me of my younger self. Over salads that neither of us had time to properly enjoy, she got straight to the point. The board is very interested in the Whitmore offer. They think the synergies could be substantial, and Harrison has a reputation for fair treatment of acquired companies. But they're concerned about retention, specifically your retention. I'm not going anywhere, I assured her. Nexus has been my professional home for 18 years. I'm not interested in jumping ship just because we change ownership. Rachel leaned forward, her voice dropping despite the private dining room. Diane, between us, the board is prepared to make a very attractive counteroffer if you're considering leaving. Your division generates 37% of our total revenue. Losing you would crater the acquisition value and potentially destabilize the entire company. I appreciated her directness even as I processed what she was really saying. The board wasn't just concerned about losing me to a competitor. They were worried I might leverage the acquisition situation to extract better terms for myself. It was a reasonable concern from their perspective, and not entirely inaccurate. Tom Harrison had already indicated that any acquisition would include substantial retention packages for key personnel, meaning me. That gave me leverage I hadn't had before. I'm loyal to Nexus, I repeated. But Rachel, I'm also 58 years old. I've given this company 2 decades of my best work. Whatever happens with the acquisition, I want to make sure that the people in my division are protected, that the operational improvements we've made aren't dismantled by new ownership, and that my legacy here reflects the actual value I've created. If that means negotiating terms that benefit me personally, I won't apologize for that. Rachel smiled. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. The board meeting is next month. They'd like you to present your vision for the division's future, regardless of ownership structure. Come prepared to talk about what you need to stay engaged and effective for another 5 years. 5 years would take me to 63, well past when I had originally planned to retire. But the truth was I loved my work. I loved the challenge of solving complex logistical problems, of building systems that function smoothly across multiple continents and time zones, of leading teams that consistently outperformed expectations. I'll be ready, I told her. And Rachel, thank you for being direct. I appreciate knowing where the board stands. After lunch, I returned to my office to find James looking troubled. There's someone in the conference room who insists on seeing you. No appointment, won't state her business, But she says it's personal and urgent. When I asked for a name, she said you'd know who she was when you saw her. My first thought was Patricia Whitmore, come to negotiate some new social arrangement or to smooth over lingering tensions from the wedding incident. But when I entered the conference room, it was Crystal Chen, Richard's new wife and technically my successor in his affections, though that was an odd way to think of someone who had come into his life 15 years after our divorce. She stood by the windows, her designer suit immaculate, her blonde hair styled in soft waves that must have taken an hour to achieve. Crystal, I said, genuinely surprised. What brings you here? We had never been enemies exactly, but we also had never been friends. Our relationship existed in that awkward space of people connected by circumstance rather than choice, maintaining polite distance at family events and avoiding topics that might lead to uncomfortable conversations about the past. She turned, and I saw that her carefully applied makeup couldn't quite hide that she had been crying. I need your help, she said without preamble. Richard is in trouble and I don't know who else to turn to. I gestured to the conference table, and we sat across from each other like negotiators rather than family members. What kind of trouble? Financial, she said, her voice shaking slightly. He made some investments based on insider information he thought was reliable. It wasn't. He's facing potential SEC investigation, and if it goes forward he could lose everything. His pension, his reputation, possibly face criminal charges. I processed this information, feeling the complicated mix of emotions that came from hearing that your ex-husband, the father of your child, the man who had left you to struggle alone for years, was now facing consequences for his own poor choices. Why are you telling me this? What do you think I can do? Crystal's hands twisted together on the table. You know people. You have connections in finance and regulatory circles. Richard is too proud to ask for help, but I'm not. I know he wasn't there for you and Marcus when you needed him. I know he has no right to ask you for anything. But I'm asking anyway because I love him and because Marcus loves him, whatever their complicated history. There was something brave about her coming here. About setting aside pride and history to advocate for her husband. I respected that even as I wrestled with whether I owed Richard anything after years of minimal child support payments and sporadic involvement in Marcus's life. Does Marcus know about this? Not yet, Crystal said. Richard wanted to handle it quietly, hoped it would just go away. But it's not going away. The investigation is moving forward, and his lawyer says his best chance is to cooperate fully and demonstrate good faith. That's easier to do with character references from people who carry weight in the business community. I sat back, looking at this woman who had married my ex-husband, and somehow managed to maintain civility with me through years of potentially awkward family dynamics. If I help Richard, it's not for him, I said slowly. It's for Marcus, who doesn't deserve to watch his father be publicly destroyed. And it's for you because you had the courage to come here and ask. But Crystal, Richard and I need to have a real conversation about his role in Marcus's life, and what he owes his son beyond just avoiding scandal. Thank you, she whispered, tears spilling over despite her efforts to maintain composure. I'll tell him to expect your call. I'll talk to some people, I said. No promises, but I'll see what can be done. After Crystal left, I sat in the conference room for a long time, staring at the city below and thinking about the tangled web of obligations and relationships that defined adult life. Richard had been a mediocre husband and an absent father, but he was still Marcus's dad. Still someone my son loved despite everything. And that meant his problems became, at least partially, my problems. I made 3 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to an old colleague who had moved into regulatory compliance at the SEC. We talked generally about processes and procedures, about how investigations worked and what factors influenced outcomes. She couldn't discuss Richard's case specifically, but she gave me enough information to understand what he was facing and what his best options might be. The second call was to a lawyer who specialized in securities law, someone I had worked with on compliance issues at Nexus. He agreed to review Richard's situation discreetly and provide strategic advice. The third call was to Richard himself. He answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse. Diane, Crystal told me she went to see you. I'm sorry she dragged you into this. I'm not, I said. Because left to your own devices, you apparently make terrible decisions. We need to talk, Richard. Not about the SEC investigation, though we'll get to that. About you and Marcus and what kind of father you've actually been. There was a long silence. Then quietly he said, I know I failed him. I failed both of you. Good, I replied. That's a starting point. Come to my office tomorrow at 6. Bring your lawyer if you want. We're going to have a very honest conversation about your choices and their consequences. That evening, I had dinner with Tom at a small Italian restaurant that neither of us had chosen for its social significance. It was simply good food and quiet atmosphere, a place where we could talk without performance or pretense. He was already seated when I arrived, reading something on his phone with an expression of concentration that softened when he saw me. I ordered wine and settled into the chair across from him, feeling the day's tension starting to ease. You look exhausted, Tom observed. Rough day. Complicated day, I corrected. Quarterly reviews, acquisition politics, and unexpected family drama. The usual executive chaos. He smiled. Want to talk about it? Or would you prefer to pretend we're just two people having dinner with no connection to corporate machinations or family complications? The second option sounds lovely, I admitted. But I'm not sure I remember how to do that anymore. When did everything become so layered? Tom reached across the table and took my hand, a simple gesture that felt more intimate than it should have in a public restaurant. That's the price of success and responsibility. Everything connects to everything else. But Diane, you're allowed to just be yourself sometimes. Not the executive, not the mother, not the person managing everyone else's problems. Just you. I looked at our joined hands, at this man who had appeared in my life through the strangest circumstances, and who somehow understood the compartments I had created and why they existed. I don't know who that person is anymore, I admitted. I've been performing roles for so long that I'm not sure where the performance ends and the authentic self begins. Tom's thumb traced circles on my palm. Then maybe we figure that out together. No agenda, no expectations. Just time to explore who we are when we're not being who everyone needs us to be. We ordered dinner and talked about nothing important. Books we had read, places we wanted to travel, childhood memories that had nothing to do with our current lives. It was remarkably ordinary and deeply peaceful. A reminder that connection could exist outside the complex web of professional and family obligations. As we were finishing dessert, Tom's expression turned more serious. I need to tell you something about the Whitmore acquisition. Business can wait, I said. We agreed this was just dinner. It's relevant to what you're navigating with Marcus and Sophie's family, he countered. Patricia Whitmore has been putting pressure on her husband to accelerate the acquisition talks. She's apparently very interested in being connected to you professionally now that she understands your actual position. She sees social advantage in having you in the extended family network. I sighed. Of course she does. She went from dismissing me as an inconvenient reminder of Marcus's humble background to calculating how my professional status can benefit her social standing. People like Patricia always view relationships as transactions. Tom nodded. I've been very clear with Richard Whitmore that any acquisition will be evaluated purely on business merits. Your personal connection to his family won't factor into my decision-making, positively or negatively. But Diane, you should know that Patricia has been dropping your name at social events, talking about her son-in-law's remarkable mother, and her close friendship with you. The audacity shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. She's rewriting history, I said, creating a narrative where she always valued me, where the wedding seating disaster never happened. That's a very convenient fiction. What do you want me to do about it? Tom asked. I can make it clear that's not accurate, though it might complicate things for Marcus and Sophie. Or I can let it go, let her tell whatever story makes her comfortable, and focus on the business aspects of the acquisition. Let it go, I decided after a moment. Patricia's need to revise reality is her problem, not mine. As long as she treats me with respect going forward, I don't care what story she tells herself about why. Tom studied me carefully. You're very generous with people who don't deserve your generosity. Sometimes, I said. Or maybe I've just learned that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when fighting them would hurt people I love. Marcus and Sophie are building their marriage. I won't sabotage that over Patricia's social calculations. The next evening, Richard arrived at my office with his lawyer in tow, both men looking like they were heading to their own execution. I had James arrange for privacy, ensuring that this conversation wouldn't be overheard or interrupted. Richard looked older than I remembered. The years and stress etched into his face in ways that made him seem almost like a stranger. We sat in my office's informal seating area, an arrangement of comfortable chairs around a low table that I use for confidential conversations. "Thank you for seeing us," Richard's lawyer began, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "This conversation is between Richard and me. You're welcome to stay, but I need to hear from him directly, not filtered through legal strategy." Richard nodded to his lawyer, who settled back in his chair with clear reluctance. "Diane, I know I have no right to ask for your help. I haven't been the husband you deserved or the father Marcus needed. I've made excuse after excuse over the years, telling myself I was doing my best when the truth is I was doing the minimum." "That's an accurate assessment," I agreed, my tone neutral. "So why should I help you now?" "Because Marcus will be devastated if I go to prison," Richard said quietly. "Because despite everything, he loves me. I see it when we have dinner, when he tells me about his life, when he looks at me like he's still hoping I'll become the father he deserved. I can't give him back the past, but I can try not to destroy his future by becoming a convicted felon." I looked at this man I had once loved, once built a life with, once believed would be my partner through everything. That version of Richard had disappeared long ago, replaced by someone who had chosen easier paths and fewer responsibilities. But he was still Marcus's father, and that meant something. "Tell me about the insider trading allegation. What exactly did you do?" Richard walked me through the situation, his lawyer occasionally interjecting legal context. "It was a stupid mistake born of desperation and greed, a tip from someone he thought he could trust. About a pending merger that never materialized. He had invested heavily, borrowed against his retirement accounts, and when the information proved false, he was left with devastating losses and the attention of regulators who wanted to know why he had made such specific trades at such specific times. You need to cooperate fully with the investigation, I said after he finished. Admit what you did, explain your reasoning, demonstrate genuine remorse. The SEC is more interested in preventing systemic problems than punishing individual stupidity. If you show that you understand you made a mistake and provide full transparency, they're more likely to go for fines and sanctions rather than criminal prosecution. Richard's lawyer nodded. That's consistent with our strategy. But it helps to have character references from respected business leaders who can speak to Richard's overall integrity, even if he made an error in judgment. I can provide that, I said. Not because you deserve it, Richard, but because Marcus deserves a father who isn't in prison. But understand this. After this is resolved, you and I are going to have a much longer conversation about your financial support of Marcus over the years, about the child support you paid sporadically, about the college expenses I covered alone. You're going to make that right, not because I need the money, but because you owe your son acknowledgement of what he was worth. Richard's eyes filled with tears. I'll do whatever you ask. Thank you, Diane. Thank you for being bigger than I deserve. The lawyer arranged for me to speak with the investigators, a carefully orchestrated conversation where I emphasized Richard's character while acknowledging his poor judgment. It was a delicate balance, providing enough support to potentially influence the outcome without compromising my own integrity or reputation. The SEC agent I spoke with was professional and appropriately skeptical, but she seemed to appreciate that someone of my standing was willing to vouch for Richard's fundamental decency, if not his decision-making. The following week unfolded in a cascade of interconnected events that felt like the universe deciding to test exactly how many complex situations I could navigate simultaneously. The Whitmore acquisition talks accelerated, with my division's performance becoming the central focus of due diligence. I spent hours in conference rooms with analysts and lawyers, walking through operational systems, explaining supply chain innovations, defending projections and assumptions that would determine the final acquisition price. Tom Harrison was present at some of these meetings, maintaining professional distance, but occasionally catching my eye with expressions that conveyed support and understanding. Patricia Whitmore had apparently told her husband that I was a close family friend, leading Richard Whitmore to approach me with awkward familiarity that I had to carefully navigate. I'm so glad Sophie married into your family, he said during a break in one negotiation session. Patricia tells me you and she have become quite close. I smiled blandly. Patricia and I have come to understand each other better. That seemed like a diplomatic response that neither confirmed nor denied Patricia's revision of our relationship history. Richard seemed satisfied with that answer, moving on to discuss technical aspects of the acquisition that were actually relevant. The man was competent in his work, I had to admit. He had risen through the ranks at Whitmore Industries through genuine skill, even if his personal life showed questionable judgment. Marcus called midweek, his voice tight with stress. Mom, Dad told me about the SEC investigation. Why didn't you tell me you were helping him? Because it wasn't my story to share, I said gently. Your father needed to tell you himself in his own time and his own way. I'm just providing what support I can to minimize the consequences of his mistakes. Are you angry at me for helping him? There was a long pause. No, Marcus said finally. I'm grateful. I don't understand why you'd help him after everything, but I'm grateful. I'm helping him because you love him, I explained. Because despite his failures as a husband and father, he's still your dad. And because people deserve second chances when they're genuinely trying to make things right. Your father has a long way to go to earn real redemption, but he's taking the first steps. Sophie and I want to take you to dinner this weekend, Marcus said, changing the subject. To thank you for everything. For helping Dad, for being so gracious with her parents, for just being you. I accepted, knowing that these gestures of gratitude were important to my son, that he needed to find ways to acknowledge what had happened and move forward. We agreed on Sunday evening at a restaurant Marcus and Sophie had discovered, a small place with good food and no social pretensions. Thursday evening, I had the working dinner with Tom Harrison that had been scheduled the previous week. We met at his office rather than a restaurant, ordering in from a place he liked and spreading papers across his conference table. This was the first time we had formally discussed the acquisition in the context of our personal relationship, and both of us seemed uncertain how to navigate the boundary between business and personal. I need to be direct with you, Tom said as we settled in with food and documents. The board at Whitmore Industries wants this acquisition. They see the synergies, they understand the value of your division, and they're prepared to make a very competitive offer. But I won't move forward unless I know you're comfortable with the terms, both professionally and personally. Personally shouldn't factor into business decisions, I pointed out. It shouldn't, Tom agreed. But reality is more complicated than that. If we acquire Nexus and you're miserable, if our personal relationship creates conflicts or complications, if you feel pressured or compromised, then the acquisition fails regardless of the financial terms. I need to know you can separate what's happening between us from what's happening in this negotiation. I assured him. I've spent my career separating personal and professional. This is just another version of that skill. We spent 3 hours reviewing terms, discussing integration strategies, negotiating protections for my division and the people who worked there. Tom was fair but firm, pushing back on some of my requests while accommodating others. It was a genuine negotiation, one where I felt respected as a professional, rather than given concessions because of our personal connection. As we were finishing, Tom leaned back in his chair and studied me. You're remarkable at this, you know. Most executives come into acquisition talks either defensive or overly aggressive. You're neither. You're just clear about what you need and willing to work toward solutions. I've had a lot of practice advocating for myself and my team, I said. And I've learned that the best negotiations aren't about winning or losing. They're about finding structures that work for everyone involved. Tom smiled. That's exactly why this acquisition makes sense. Your approach to operations, to leadership, to problem solving, that's what Whitmore Industries needs. The financial projections are impressive, but what really matters is how you think about building systems and developing people. As I left his office that evening, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. The acquisition would probably move forward. Richard's legal troubles would likely resolve with fines rather than prison time. Marcus and Sophie would build their marriage with better understanding of family complexities. And Tom Harrison would continue to be part of my life in ways that combine professional respect with personal connection. Everything was moving toward resolution, though not always in the ways I had anticipated. Sunday dinner with Marcus and Sophie exceeded my expectations. The restaurant they had chosen was warm and unpretentious, with servers who seemed to genuinely care about the food and the experience. Sophie had clearly prepared for the conversation, thinking through what she wanted to say and how to say it. Mrs. Chen, I've been thinking a lot about the wedding and everything that happened. Not just the seating issue but all the assumptions my parents made about you and your background. Please call me Diane, I interjected gently. We're family now. Sophie nodded, looking grateful for the informality. Diane then. I grew up in a very specific environment where money and status determined worth. My parents taught me, mostly by example, that people could be sorted into categories based on education and wealth and family background. Meeting you and understanding who you actually are has forced me to confront how wrong those assumptions were. Marcus reached over and took Sophie's hand, his expression proud. We've been talking a lot about privilege and perspective, about how we want to build our life together differently than how we were raised. Sophie continued, her voice stronger now. I don't want to be like my mother, judging people based on superficial criteria. I want to see people as individuals, respect their stories and struggles and successes on their own terms. You've shown me what that looks like, how someone can be successful professionally while remaining grounded personally. I felt unexpected emotion rising in my throat. That means more to me than you know, Sophie. I made a lot of choices over the years about how to raise Marcus and how to navigate my career. I was never sure if I was making the right decisions. But if my approach has helped you think differently about people and relationships, then maybe all those complicated choices were worth it. We spent the rest of dinner talking about their plans, their hopes for the future, the kind of family they wanted to build together. Marcus told stories about his childhood that I had almost forgotten, moments that had seemed ordinary at the time, but had apparently shaped his understanding of values and priorities. Sophie listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she wanted to understand not just the facts but the meaning behind them. I could see how much my son loved this woman, how their relationship was pushing both of them to grow and question, and become better versions of themselves. As we were leaving, Sophie pulled me aside while Marcus was settling the check. I need to tell you something else. My mother has been talking about you constantly since the penthouse dinner. She's impressed, which for her is significant. But Diane, I want you to know that my feelings about you aren't based on your professional accomplishments. Yes, it's impressive that you've achieved what you have. But what really matters to me is how you raised Marcus, the kind of man he became because of your influence. That's the success that counts. I hugged her, this young woman who was learning to see beyond the categories she had been raised with. Thank you, Sophie. And thank you for being patient with all of us as we navigate this new family structure. The Nexus board meeting happened the following Tuesday. A high-stakes presentation where I laid out my vision for the division's future under any ownership structure. I had prepared meticulously, anticipating questions and objections, building a case that was both compelling and realistic. The board members listened intently as I walked through 5 years of projected growth, explaining how the operational systems we had built could scale significantly with proper investment and support. I addressed concerns about integration challenges, about whether our culture and approach could survive a change in ownership, about what would happen if key personnel left during a transition. My presentation lasted 90 minutes, followed by another hour of questions that ranged from technical details to strategic philosophy. Rachel Torres caught me afterward in the hallway. That was masterful, Diane. You didn't just make the case for your division's value. You made it impossible for them to imagine Nexus without you. The board is going to approve whatever retention package keeps you engaged. I appreciated the compliment but felt the weight of what it meant. If the board was going to offer substantial incentives for me to stay, that meant they were also prepared to accept the acquisition. My division's future would be secure, but it would be under Whitmore Industries' ownership, reporting to Tom Harrison and integrated into a larger corporate structure. That evening, I sat in my penthouse watching the sun set over the city and thinking about transitions. In the past 6 weeks, everything had shifted. My carefully maintained separation between professional success and personal identity had dissolved. My son understood more about my career and accomplishments than I had ever intended to share. The family he had married into had been forced to confront their assumptions and prejudices. And I had started a relationship with a man who complicated every easy category I had used to organize my life. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Tom. I just heard from our board. They're prepared to move forward with the Nexus acquisition if we can agree on terms. Your board apparently signaled they would approve with the right retention packages for key personnel. This is actually happening, Diane. Our companies are going to merge, and we're going to have to figure out how to navigate that professionally while also navigating whatever is happening between us personally. I know, I said, feeling the weight and promise of that reality. It's complicated. He laughed. Everything about you is complicated. Your relationship with your son, your ex-husband's drama, Your new daughter-in-law's family, your career, your choices about how you present yourself to the world. None of it is simple. But Diane, complicated isn't bad. It's just real. We talked for another hour about practicalities and possibilities, about concerns and hopes. When we finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. For years, I had maintained careful control over how people saw me, compartmentalizing my life into manageable pieces that didn't intersect. The wedding seating incident had shattered those compartments, forcing everything into the open. And while the exposure had been painful, it had also been liberating. I no longer had to hide my success or downplay my accomplishments. I no longer had to pretend to be someone smaller than I actually was. The people in my life now saw me fully, professionally accomplished and personally grounded, successful and still connected to my roots. It was uncomfortable and complicated and deeply uncertain, but it was also finally authentic. The next morning I called Marcus. "We need to talk about your grandfather," I said without preamble. "I've never told you much about my father or why we lost touch before you were born. I think it's time you knew that story." We met for coffee at a place near his apartment, and I told him things I had kept private for decades. About growing up poor in rural Ohio, about my father's alcoholism and violence, about my mother's quiet strength as she worked multiple jobs to keep us fed and housed. I explained how education had been my escape, how MIT had felt like another planet compared to the world I came from. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression shifting as he absorbed information that recontextualized everything he knew about me. "So when Sophie's parents made assumptions about your background," he said slowly, "they were partially right. You did come from very little. You just transformed that into something extraordinary through intelligence and work ethic." "Exactly," I confirmed. "And that's why their dismissal stung so much. Not because they were wrong about where I started, but because they assumed where I started determined my worth. They couldn't imagine that someone from my background could achieve what I had achieved. Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" Marcus asked. "Why let me think we were just regular middle-class people when you were actually extraordinarily successful?" "Because I wanted you to develop your own identity," I explained. "I didn't want you to feel pressure to live up to my success, or to feel like you had a safety net that would catch you no matter what choices you made. I wanted you to work hard because you valued work, not because you were afraid of losing privilege. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe I should have been more honest. But I was trying to give you the gift of becoming yourself without the burden of my expectations or achievements." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. "It wasn't wrong, Mom. I understand now why you made those choices. And I'm grateful for them, even if they created some awkward situations. Sophie and I have been talking about how we want to raise our future kids, and your approach is actually really inspiring. We want them to understand privilege and responsibility, to appreciate opportunities without taking them for granted. Hearing about your childhood helps me understand how to think about that." We talked for 2 more hours, filling in gaps and details, building a more complete picture of my life and choices. When we finally parted, I felt lighter, as if sharing these stories had released some weight I hadn't known I was carrying. The following weeks blurred together in a cascade of negotiations and transitions. The acquisition moved forward with surprising speed, once both boards had committed to the basic framework. Legal teams worked through details, financial analysts confirmed valuations, integration specialists began planning how to combine operational systems. Through it all, I maintained my division's performance, ensuring that the day-to-day work continued smoothly despite the larger corporate changes happening around us. My team knew something significant was unfolding, but I worked to keep them focused on immediate priorities rather than uncertain futures. When the acquisition was finally announced publicly, I gathered my division for a town hall meeting where I could address their concerns directly. "We're being acquired by Whitmore Industries," I told the assembled group of managers and employees who had worked with me for years. "This is going to bring changes, some of them challenging. But I want you to know that I've negotiated protections for our division, for our culture, for the way we do things. I'm staying on as division head, reporting directly to their CEO. Your jobs are secure, your projects will continue, and our approach to operations will be respected and actually expanded to other parts of the combined company." The relief in the room was palpable. These were people who had built their careers alongside mine, who had trusted me to lead them through complex challenges, who depended on me to protect their interests during times of uncertainty. Questions followed, some about practical details and others about philosophical concerns. I answered each one honestly, acknowledging what I knew and admitting what remained uncertain. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted from anxiety to cautious optimism. James pulled me aside afterward. "You're good at this," he observed. "At managing people through change, at making them feel seen and secure even when things are uncertain. Have you ever thought about teaching? Sharing what you know with the next generation of leaders?" I smiled at the suggestion. "Maybe someday. Right now, I'm still figuring out how to manage my own life through change. But ask me again in 5 years when I'm actually ready to retire." The SEC investigation into Richard's trading violations concluded with sanctions and fines but no criminal charges, exactly as I had hoped. He called to thank me, his voice heavy with emotion and genuine remorse. "I don't deserve your help, Diane. I know that. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the grace you've shown me. Start by being a better father to Marcus," I told him. "That's the only redemption that actually matters." He promised he would, and I chose to believe him, or at least to believe he would try. Patricia Whitmore invited me to lunch at her club, a formal affair where she could introduce me to her social circle and solidify whatever narrative she had constructed about our relationship. I accepted because refusing would have created unnecessary tension, but I went with clear boundaries. Over expensive salads and wine I didn't really want, Patricia talked about charity boards and social events, about opportunities for us to collaborate on various initiatives that would benefit from my business expertise and her social connections. I listened politely, making non-committal responses, until finally I interrupted her practiced pitch. "Patricia, I appreciate the invitations, and I'm happy to have a cordial relationship with you for Marcus and Sophie's sake. But let's be clear. We're not friends. We're family by marriage, which is different. I don't need to be part of your social circle, and I don't need you to facilitate professional opportunities. I'm perfectly capable of building my own networks and relationships." She looked taken aback, her carefully maintained composure cracking slightly. "I was only trying to be helpful," she said stiffly. "I'm sure you were," I replied. "And if I need help navigating social situations in your world, I'll ask for it. But right now what I need is for you to treat me with consistent respect, to honor my role as Marcus's mother, and to stop trying to rewrite history about how we got here. We had a rocky start because of assumptions you made and actions you took. We're moving past that, which is good. But moving past doesn't mean pretending it never happened." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on her wine glass. "You're right," she said finally. "I made terrible assumptions about you. I treated you poorly because I couldn't imagine someone from your background achieving what you've achieved. That says more about my limitations than yours. I'm sorry, truly sorry, for the wedding seating situation and for all the subtle dismissals before that. I appreciate the apology," I said. "And I accept it. But Patricia, understand that respect given because of professional status is hollow. I want to be treated well because I'm a person deserving of basic human dignity, because I'm Marcus's mother, not because I'm an executive at a company your husband's employer is acquiring." She nodded slowly. "That's fair. And difficult for me to fully internalize, because I've spent my whole life in environments where status determined treatment. But I'll try. For Sophie and Marcus, I'll try." We finished lunch with easier conversation, finding common ground in our shared concern for the young couple and their future. It wasn't friendship, and it probably never would be. But it was a working relationship built on acknowledged history and genuine effort to do better. That felt like enough, maybe even like progress. Tom and I had dinner the following weekend at my penthouse, cooking together in a kitchen that was too fancy for actual use, but which we managed to make feel homey through our combined incompetence with the high-end appliances. We laughed as we figured out how to work the professional-grade stove, joked about needing instruction manuals for the refrigerator, and eventually produced a meal that was decent if not spectacular. It was ordinary in the best possible way. A reminder that beneath the corporate titles and complex family dynamics, we were just two people trying to build connection. After dinner, we sat on the terrace watching the city lights and talking about the future. The acquisition would close in 3 months. I would formally become part of Whitmore Industries, reporting to Tom but maintaining significant autonomy over my division. We had negotiated terms that protected my team and our operational approach while providing resources for expansion and growth. Professionally, everything was aligned. Personally, everything remained complicated but promising. "What do you want, Diane?" Tom asked, turning to look at me directly. "Not what you think you should want, not what makes sense strategically, not what's best for everyone else. What do you actually want for yourself?" I considered the question, really thought about it rather than providing an automatic response. "I want to keep doing work I love while also having space for life outside that work. I want Marcus to build a happy marriage without worrying about me or feeling obligated to manage family tensions. I want Richard to actually become the father he should have been all along. And I want to see where this thing between us goes without pressure or expectations, just honest exploration of what might be possible." "That sounds reasonable," Tom said with a smile. "Challenging to execute but reasonable. And Diane, for what it's worth, I want the same thing. Professional success, family peace, an honest exploration of what we might build together. No guarantees, no predetermined outcomes, just genuine effort and authentic connection." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the city below. Somewhere in those millions of lights were Marcus and Sophie building their life, Richard and Crystal navigating his legal troubles and rehabilitation, Patricia Whitmore adjusting her worldview one uncomfortable realization at a time. My world had expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated, bringing complexity but also richness, challenge but also opportunity. The wedding seating incident that had seemed like such a devastating insult had actually been a catalyst for transformation. It had forced everything hidden into the light, shattered my carefully constructed compartments, and required everyone in my orbit to confront assumptions and adjust understanding. The process had been painful, but pain sometimes preceded growth. I was no longer performing the role of modest middle-class mother, while hiding my professional success. I was no longer protecting Marcus from knowing about my achievements or my struggles. I was no longer accepting dismissal with silent grace, hoping dignity alone would prove my worth. I was simply being myself, fully and honestly letting people see all the pieces and decide for themselves how they wanted to engage with me. Some, like Patricia, would struggle with that honesty and require ongoing work to build genuine respect. Others, like Sophie, would embrace the complexity and grow from understanding it. Marcus was learning to see his mother as a complete person rather than just a parent, appreciating both my sacrifices and my successes. And Tom was choosing to build something with me precisely because of that complexity rather than in spite of it. The future remained uncertain in countless ways. The acquisition might bring challenges I hadn't anticipated. Family dynamics might shift in unexpected directions. My relationship with Tom might flourish or might founder under the weight of professional entanglement. But uncertainty was better than the false security of carefully maintained illusions. At least now, whatever happened would be based on truth rather than performance, on authentic connection rather than strategic presentation. At 58 years old, I was finally learning to stop hiding, to stop making myself smaller, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The lesson had come through pain and public humiliation, through family drama and professional complications. But it had come, and I was grateful for it, even as I navigated the messy reality of living fully visible rather than carefully controlled. The thought made me smile as I sat on my terrace, Tom's hand warm in mine, the city spreading out below us in all its complicated glory. Somewhere down there, people were making assumptions about each other, judging based on appearances, missing the truth of who stood before them. I had been one of those people once, had participated in the same calculations and categories even as I resented being subjected to them. But maybe, just maybe, my small disruption of Patricia Whitmore's assumptions would ripple outward, would cause others to question their own judgments, would contribute to a slightly more expansive understanding of human worth and potential. It was a small hope, perhaps even a grandiose one. But it was mine, and I was done apologizing for hoping that my life and choices might matter beyond just my own survival and success. 3 years after that wedding where I had no seat, Marcus and Sophie hosted Thanksgiving at their new home. The dining table stretched long enough to accommodate everyone who mattered. Richard and Crystal sat beside Tom and me, an arrangement that would have seemed impossible years earlier. Patricia and her husband occupied seats near Sophie's end, their demeanor noticeably softer than when we first met. The biggest change sat in a high chair between Marcus and Sophie. My granddaughter Elena watched the gathering with wide dark eyes that reminded me of my own mother, the woman who had cleaned houses so I could dream bigger dreams. Elena would grow up knowing her grandmother's full story, understanding that success could come from humble beginnings, that worth wasn't determined by where you started, but by how you treated people along the way. Patricia caught my eye across the table and raised her glass slightly, a private acknowledgement between us. We would never be close friends, but we had arrived at something more valuable than friendship. We had mutual respect earned through difficult conversations and genuine efforts to change. She no longer introduced me as her close friend but simply as Marcus's mother, which was exactly right. Richard had kept his promise, showing up consistently for Marcus in ways he never had before. His near disaster with the SEC had shaken something loose in him, forcing him to confront the father he had been versus the father he wanted to become. He still had miles to go, but he was walking the path instead of just talking about it. Tom squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture invisible to everyone else but deeply felt. The acquisition had succeeded beyond projections, my division thriving under the expanded resources while maintaining its culture. We had learned to separate professional obligations from personal connection, though both continued to deepen and intertwine in ways that felt natural rather than complicated. As dinner concluded and conversation flowed around me, I thought about that moment in the ballroom doorway, standing with no assigned seat, feeling erased from my own son's celebration. That humiliation had cracked open something essential, had forced authenticity where performance had once sufficed. I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, but I couldn't regret what it had taught me about visibility, about worth, about the courage required to take up space unapologetically. Elena banged her tiny hands on the high chair tray, demanding attention. I rose to lift her out, holding my granddaughter close while she grabbed at my necklace with sticky fingers. She would never know a grandmother who hid her success or made herself smaller. She would grow up seeing women who owned their accomplishments, who demanded respect regardless of status, who understood that true class meant treating everyone with dignity. That legacy felt more valuable than any corner office or acquisition deal. It was the inheritance that actually mattered, passed from my mother to me, and now from me to this next generation. The wedding where I had no seat had taught me to claim my place at every table. Now I was teaching Elena to do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out,